Welcome to the Icelandic Roots podcast. I'm your host, Jack, and this is my conversation with Atli Halldórsson. We are really getting excited here around the Icelandic Roots community about some of the upcoming things going on. The INLNA convention in Gimli, Manitoba, the 150th anniversary of that area. And also in general, thinking about the growing ties between North America and Scandinavia. So stay tuned for this conversation as Atli and I discuss the 3 most Icelandic cities in the world. Atli?
That was a wonderful introduction.
Wow.
Hi everyone, my name is Atli Halldórsson, and I work as the co-project manager of the Snorri Programs, along with Julie Summers. She's
Julie
not here
Summers.
today, as she's in Germany, and the time difference would just be kind of crazy.
Mm-hmm. And you're coming to us from Vancouver, which is now where you've been spending like a lot of your time when you're not in Iceland. So, how is the weather there?
Well, whenever anyone asks that question, there's about a 90% chance that the answer is going to be raining. And today, we're hitting that 90% chance.
Would you say, this might be a difficult question. I don't know how I would answer that. Which weather do you prefer? The climate in Iceland or in Vancouver? And I suppose that might depend on the time of year and the season.
Yeah. The Vancouver climate is certainly much, much milder. And during this time of year, when there's when it actually feels like spring and the daily highs are like 10 degrees, and when the sun does shine every other week, it does feel very nice to be outside. And in Iceland, we don't really quite get the same spring as we do here, and it does arrive much later. Like today, I saw dandelions blooming from some flower pots, and there have been many other plants, spring plants, just starting to bloom seemingly overnight in the last couple of weeks. Whereas, Iceland at this time of year is still pretty dark. It's getting a lot brighter, but it still is windy. And in Iceland, you're constantly teased with the arrival of spring. You have about 3 or 4 fall springs before spring actually gets there. And then when spring does, it's very short, and it just becomes summer immediately.
Yeah, but you're going back to Iceland quite soon, yeah?
Yeah, this is actually the final month as of today. And that's kind of a big change. I've been living in Vancouver for the last 2 winters, and we've had our apartment, but we'll be actually canceling our lease here and just kind of moving across the Atlantic. So that's a big life change.
Yeah, no kidding. Also, coming to Canada, of course, has been a big life change, you could say. You talked about the weather differences. Is there anything else you could say? And I guess I didn't really realize this, that you're kind of wrapping up this stage, at least at this point, and going back to Iceland more permanently. So what have been some interesting things that you've learned or experienced being here in Canada for, as you said, the last 2 winters?
There have been a lot of just cultural differences I've noticed. For me, personally, it has kind of, I don't know, I'd say that living abroad and living in a big city, that does change a person's view on life and their mindset. It's, been pretty developing. But that's also something that I've gone through when I've lived in other countries outside of Iceland and Canada too. And for Canada specifically, one of the things I do appreciate here is that it's very easy to just talk to people or kind of just start a conversation with a stranger on the streets. because we don't tend to do that in Iceland. So that's pretty friendly.
Yeah. You also lived in Denmark. Was it right in Copenhagen when you were there?
It was in Aarhus, and Aarhus is kind of like the Vancouver of Copenhagen in a way, being the second
Okay.
biggest city in the country.
That is also where you learned to ride your bicycle with no hands, right? So that is a very Vancouver thing. And I guess Copenhagen has it too.
Yeah. Yeah, I learned it there, but I mastered it in Vancouver.
Yes.
So that's very
There's
fun. For those of you that don't follow me on Instagram, I regularly post on my story short videos of myself riding without using my hands.
Yeah. I think in Iceland, bicycles do not get the same usage, probably mainly due to the weather. Copenhagen is absolutely insane with how many people ride their bicycles. There's like some crazy statistics, kind of like how Iceland skews a lot of the per capita stats. You can kind of reference some interesting things that really promote certain aspects of Iceland. In Denmark, they have that same sort of thing, but with bicycles. And
Yeah.
it's like
You've
maybe
been
1 in
there.
5 people has a bike.
You've been there, right?
Yeah, I went there last year, like maybe May, from Iceland. Flew to Copenhagen.
About a year ago.
Yeah. And that was just, very shocking. Another observation, too, which was really interesting, when you are, say, a North American person, or maybe really anyone who is not living or from Europe, uh, you hear like Scandinavia referenced so much. And oftentimes you maybe think of like the IKEA sort of idea of what Scandinavia is, or different aspects. And that understanding is an oversimplification that makes you think that every Scandinavian country is very similar. And that, once you start visiting these different countries in Scandinavia, you realize that there's such differences between them. They are very much distinctly their own different countries. And I was just shocked when I went to Copenhagen. I was not prepared at all. Walking the streets downtown, it felt very much like a Paris sort of vibe. So a Parisian kind of cafe culture, the tables and chairs spilling out into the streets and people just drinking their coffee on the street in the morning. And then at night, just drinking wine and beer. And it was that kind of casual lifestyle with the old historic architecture. And to me, I'm walking around and I think, well, this is Paris. It's that kind of vibe. This is not what I think of when I think of Scandinavia, especially when my Scandinavia, in air quotes, idea has been fostered by pretty much just in Iceland. Reykjavik is a very much different sort of vibe than Copenhagen. And so that was all very insightful for me.
Sure is, and Reykjavik doesn't have the climate of Copenhagen.
Very different.
There's only Icelanders that actually do believe that the Danish weather and the Danish summers are good because what we compare it to, but nobody else considers Denmark to have spectacular weather or good summers. It's just normal. But then it's also those same Icelanders that moved to Winnipeg and Gimli in 150 years ago and just thought to themselves, man, this place is amazing, I guess, and could deal with that harsh climate and those winters. And interestingly enough, this always comes to my mind when I speak of or think of Copenhagen, Reykjavik, and Winnipeg. I think it's such an interesting fact that Winnipeg was once the biggest Icelandic city in the world. Reykjavik wasn't the biggest Icelandic city until about 50 to 100 years ago.
Wow.
And for most of history, Copenhagen was the biggest Icelandic city, as in biggest Icelandic city being the city with the most number of Icelanders in it. But Winnipeg was also the city in the world that had the most Icelandic literary publications for a time period during those Östurferðir, during the emigration west.
Wow. That's a really fascinating statement. I've never heard it referenced in those terms before. And I get what you mean, of course. Biggest Icelandic city, meaning biggest city with Icelanders in it. Yeah, wow. That's so cool. What a good perspective to have.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the biggest Icelandic city being the one place where most Icelanders are gathered or most
Mhm.
Icelanders are living at in the same time because of the time when people were moving west. All the towns in Iceland, they were so small. They were
Mhm.
tiny. You only needed a few people to get together to beat all the towns in Iceland. Well, I guess not just a few, but kind of the bar wasn't high.
Mhm. Yeah. And Winnipeg, of course, still to this day, we can talk about it soon. So Gimli is, of course, not part of Winnipeg, nor is it even really close enough to be considered like a suburban type part. Like it's a distinctly far off and different town. But the connection to Iceland certainly runs through Winnipeg, Gimli, and surrounding areas and other towns that have that heritage. Anyways, in all of those regions, that kind of central hub of Icelanders in Manitoba, that culture is still maintained today. I was so surprised. And again, I spent less than a week, but nearly a week in Copenhagen. But I just spent the days walking the streets, going to museums and art galleries. And of course, having this Icelandic heritage that I have and coming from Iceland, I was thinking about Iceland the whole time. I wore my lopapeysa, my Icelandic sweater. It was a horrible idea because it was like such a warm spring. It was like 20 degrees Celsius every day in Copenhagen, and I was way too hot in my Icelandic sweater. But there was like no references to Iceland that I could really find. And of course, this is a huge city. And so you have to really dig deep. And I was not talking to people in the streets or really trying hard to uncover Icelandic roots in Copenhagen. But I did go to their national museum. And what there was about Iceland was like a couple tiny little exhibit glass installations and like a
Mhm.
few offhand references to like when Iceland was under Danish control and just like a couple things about trade. And like that was it. There was really nothing about modern day connection to Iceland. And there was very little really to do with Icelandic history or Greenland for that matter. And I thought that was quite interesting because those, to me, those connections I think are really strong. And the Danish National Museum was also just generally, it was about world history. There were so many artifacts from all different African countries, South Asian countries, uh, and even, I guess, South American too. And I thought it was like a great representation to show that, yeah, throughout Danish history, there was a lot of that sort of colonizing mindset, not always even in a negative way, but exploration as well. And a lot of Danish explorers that were traveling the world and bringing back artifacts and doing research and those sorts of things. So there was so much more emphasis on different parts of the world than like Iceland or Greenland, which have more, in my mind, of a direct connection to Denmark. But maybe that's just kind of the idea that, I don't know, perhaps at least from the museum's curatorial perspective, they're trying to show Denmark as like a global, a connection all around the globe and not just to Scandinavia or to Iceland. I don't know. Does that make any sense at all? Do you have any experience? Did you go to museums, history museums in Denmark?
I'd say that first of all, to answer the last question, I did, and I also went to Statens Museum for Kunst, which is
Hmm.
the National Art Gallery,
Yes. Wow.
which I
Fantastic
think you
place.
remember.
Hmm.
Amazingly enough, when I was there, Monet's aquarelles were on display,
Wow.
and those are paintings that can only be displayed every 4 years or so because
Hmm.
the watercolors in it, they have to rest and be kept in a dark space in order to not get bleached or whatever by sun and exposure. So that was really cool to see. And the kind of on the other topic of Danish colonialism, I'd say that I have a lot of friends in Denmark, and from them, they're all very welcoming and fun, friendly people. However, it's also on the streets of Denmark, you do kind of get this colonial vibe in the same way that the Brits have this kind of yearning or nostalgia for when the sun never set on the British Empire. There's this kind of like lack of humility about it, and kind of like joking about these things, which, of course, joking about things is fine and comedy, but there's always a seriousness, and we always have to just look at the big picture. And especially with what's been happening in the world and the whole conversation about Greenland, I think that the biggest problem that we're having is that everyone's talking about Greenland and nobody's listening to the Greenlanders. And from my point of view, I think that, and from what I've seen, I think it's awesome that some of the Greenlanders see Iceland's independence history as a role model for their own. And that's something that actually kind of, I think, is touching. And without going into more politics on that, those are kind of my experiences.
Yeah, that's a really good. I resonate with what you're saying. And yeah, I guess just thinking about it, I really did expect, because Greenland has had this historical connection, both to Iceland, but also to Greenland, that I expected, there was a lot of different things in Iceland. For example, the museum and not for there, the other town right down in the fjord there. It's about Leif Erikson and
Yeah,
is it Erikstadir. What is that town again? I'm totally blanking.
Búðardalur.
Yeah, Buddha. Okay, thank you. I've spent a lot of time there. I should know that. That museum, for example, just shows the Norse migration. And it shows, the Norse settlers at that time going from Iceland to Greenland, and then their explorations to North America. And it just shows it as sort of like a anthropological inquiry, historical facts, and theorizing about things that we don't have evidence for. So I expected exhibitions like that. And I'm not saying those don't exist in Denmark, but at least from the National Museum, that sort of stuff was not readily available. And that's kind of what I was looking for. I really, really expected more references to Greenland culture, Icelandic culture, just because of those connections that Denmark has had. And that's where maybe, like you say, there's perhaps a lack of humility, and not really reconciling with the past and the historical connections there, which is just an interesting topic. I guess, yeah. You mentioned as well the National Art Museum, the SMK, if people can look that up. And that was phenomenal. My biggest regret is I went to that during a half day that I had. I had to go to the airport that day, catch a flight back to Iceland. Whereas I went to the National Museum and spent the whole 6 hours there, spent a full day. Whereas I should have done the reverse, because the art museum there was just absolutely phenomenal. And one of the best, I would imagine, throughout all of Europe. There were so many different artists. You mentioned Monet. For me, who was that? A French painter? I don't know. It won't come to me off the top of my head. But there was just some phenomenal masterworks all the way back to the Renaissance. So that was interesting. And then more contemporary. Do you know Helgrimur Helgason?
Yes.
Yes. Do you know him personally, by the way? Because I'd really like to connect with them.
Kind of. He was, Iceland being Iceland and all that, he was my best friend's half-sister's first husband.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, funny enough, I don't think I have. Maybe I have. I forget. I use the Icelandic roots database so much that I forget who I've looked up. But I should maybe check out my relations to him. But he had an exhibition there. Not only is he an author, but he is also a painter. So I'm just going to type in to try to look up where it's maybe the Nordic House. Does that ring a bell as a place in Copenhagen? He had an exhibition there. And so there are some contemporary, the North Atlantic House in Copenhagen ran last spring. Group Portrait of the Self was his exhibition. So yes, there are still lots of connections between Denmark and Iceland. And in this case, it was, showcasing the arts, well-known artists from Iceland and having an exhibition there. And I follow a lot of his work, and he seems to be in Denmark quite often and doing talks, representing his books and his artworks as well. So contemporary, there's a lot of cross-collaboration.
Absolutely. And if we're just kind of on the topic of chatting about things and Denmark-Iceland relations, there is this saying in Iceland, I don't know really how common it is, but it is that for an Icelander to become famous in Denmark, he first must become world famous. And this is kind of, and now, well, this is kind of the case with Björk. She gained fame in the whole world before she became popular in Denmark. And this is also same for a number of kind of Icelandic artists or just celebrities that are popular in Denmark and well known in the world. But on the most kind of insider scoop that I can give, this is from when I was in school in Denmark. My teacher my art teacher in art school, he went to university with Ólafur Elíasson. And the thing is, Ólafur Elíasson is known as this Icelandic artist who is, has this niche of being from Iceland, right? But for the most part, he grew up in Denmark.
Quite sure. Kjarval? What is his first name? Johannes?
There are two of them.
I think the gallery is named after.
Yeah, I think that's Johannes.
Okay. I'm quite sure he went and studied in Denmark. And then I know Ásmundur Sveinsson did as well. And that seems like quite a trend. And, well, of course, a lot of people did, but we're talking about artists mainly here. But then I don't know how much that ever translates to, like, their works being well known in Denmark. Once again, you go to the art museums in Reykjavik or elsewhere in Iceland, and you see a lot of the local artists, a couple of which I just mentioned, represented. Or Sveinsson, his sculptures are all across the countryside and in the city. Whereas, in Copenhagen, even in their National Art Museum, like, none of those artists were represented. And I think that's a bit of a shame. Like, to me, they are world caliber artists, without a doubt.
And so they're mostly big statues, right? And they'll be public or in galleries. So another actually very personal connection that I do have to that is that I went to a job interview at the factory where they cast his sculptures. And that's in a small town. I believe it's called Svenbo in southern Denmark on the island of Fyn.
Wow.
And, well, that was pretty cool to see. But I don't think we actually cast bronze anywhere in Iceland unless someone has it kind of a hobby. So that work is outsourced to Denmark, being one of our, also, they still are a very kind of close trading partner with us. And they have many services that Icelanders get. And the systems are just so integrated. It's actually the Nordics are more akin to the Canadian provinces than they are to different national countries, in a way where if I can move completely freely between the Nordics
Hmm.
due to due to the um due to this old contract that we have. And when I do move, I gain almost the same status as citizen, except for not being able to vote for parliament and not being able to, well, run for parliament, I think, or other higher positions.
Mm.
But I do get eligibility to vote in local elections. So that's kind of the same difference as moving from, say, Calgary to Vancouver. Uh, well, of course, you still have the federal elections
Yes.
where you can vote, but I don't know. Does your voting right change between provinces, or can you
Not
vote in both?
federally. Yeah, definitely not federally. And I don't know exactly. There would be some like timing issues,
Mm-hmm.
like how long did you move out of Alberta? And if there was a provincial election coming right up, I think there's some like wiggle room, if you're maybe 1 month away. I don't know this off the top of my head, but I've heard people reference these sorts of things before. But yeah, that's a good analogy. It would not be so dissimilar to the differences between provinces, the differences between the Nordic countries that you experience. Have you been to Finland?
Not yet. It's
Mm.
on the list that I've been meaning to go there the last 2 years or so, but haven't been able to get around to it.
That seems like starting to become the Scandinavian country that is the most furthest removed from Iceland in terms of sort of cultural ties or recent historical ties. Would you say?
I'd say that it's very interesting because the two languages are the kind of furthest removed. Iceland being far
Yeah.
removed from Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish, and Finnish being the furthest removed from all the rest, really having
Mhm.
very different lineage. However, in a kind of more day to day and person to person way, I'd say Icelanders and Finns, they get along really well. They have
Mm.
kind of similar values and are often just kind of like chill and
Mm.
maybe not that well, maybe they don't always talk that much. So they definitely have a lot in common, many similarities. And I wouldn't say at all there's like any kind of gap between them except
Mm.
for the language. But then again, English speaking Finns and Icelanders are so common and so
Mhm.
proficient at that kind of study due to really the very good educational systems that we have, that Icelanders and Finns will almost always be able to communicate,
In
but
English.
they would switch over to English
Yes.
because the Finnish would have to know Swedish and the Danish, one of
Mm.
the three big languages, or those three
Mhm.
similar languages, for them to be able to communicate. But then on
Yes.
top of that, you might have accent. So an Icelander that speaks Danish and is kind of okay at Swedish, speaking with a Finn that speaks Swedish, but not the other two, they'd have a lot of communication issues, but they could also figure it out that way and
Mhm.
understand each other. But then if it's something that requires efficiency or effectiveness, like when we do business and trade with each other, then speaking English can be a benefit just for everyone to be on the same page at the same speed.
Mm. Yeah, I've heard that reference before, like an Icelander speaking partial Danish to a Finn speaking partial Swedish, and you can figure things out. And I've heard that reference as like speaking Scandinavian, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like there's enough similarities, and even me as a non-speaker of any of the Scandinavian languages, even Icelandic still, I will admit. But going through museums and galleries and these sorts of things in Finland, it would often be in English, Finnish, and Swedish. So Swedish was very prevalent, the third most spoken language there. So I would start to recognize some similarities in Swedish words that would be similar or the same to Icelandic words, but then the Finnish language being totally different, at least when it's written. Now, listening to it spoken on the streets, the mannerisms, the cadence, it was not so dissimilar to Icelandic. Like there were certain, if I listen to people conversing in Finnish, I could kind of get the gist of whether they were being humorous or serious, or kind of I could approximate what they were probably talking about based on how I think about people speaking Icelandic. There's a certain way that you speak to each other that I recognize as very similar to Finnish, even though the languages, and I know this, like you said, they're very different, Icelandic and Finnish, but the similarities in how it's spoken, I think that was at least just my observation of my time there and hearing people on the streets.
That's interesting.
Yeah. But I did think I noticed exactly what you said. Like there was a similar kind of attitude, and I almost felt like Helsinki was like could have been just a mega city in Iceland. You know, if Iceland,
Right.
their population increased a whole bunch and now all of a sudden had a city with millions of people, I think it would be like Helsinki. And even in like the architectural style and stuff, like that felt like that idea, getting back to, as I was saying, kind of the expectations you have of what Scandinavia means, that was more in line with it than what I felt in Copenhagen. That just felt, well, as I described, like kind of the sandstone, the architecture, kind of like Paris street design almost.
That's really interesting. That's also kind of, I think we can look at geography.
Mm-hmm.
If we just contrast this Parisian Danish culture, the kind of colder Finnish and Icelandic cultures, which aren't necessarily cold, it's just maybe, at least I imagine, due to the climate being colder, and maybe some of the architectural styles and city building and, well, society building in some ways. That's very much something I think we can trace back to the Middle Ages, when the court of Louis XVI was the envy of all other courts in Europe. The Danish at that point, they had their court and they very much wanted to be like them. However, the Finnish and certainly the Icelandic didn't have a court. It was just a series of farmhouses and farmers with very little organization at the time. The Finnish, I don't know as much about their history, but I kind of imagine, just because of geographic distance, they might be more influenced by the courts of Eastern Europe and their neighbors there. However, those were too influenced by the Parisian courts.
Yeah, it's a fascinating historical connections through all of it. Now, let's bring this up. It's actually kind of funny how this conversation got going. I really didn't know what we would talk about, but these are things that we've mentioned, and I've actually been meaning to like have a conversation with you since going to some of these other Scandinavian countries and cities, because I think it's very insightful once you start to understand different reference points and then thinking about, as you just outlined, the historical evolution of how the different countries evolved to the present day. Now, playing off of the idea that you put forward, the three most Icelandic cities in the world being Reykjavik, Copenhagen, and Winnipeg, we could bring our attention to Winnipeg and just a little bit north to Gimli in particular, maybe, which has its 150th anniversary this year. And coinciding with that is the INLNA convention, which is coming up soon. But then also, of course, will be the Icelandic in the summertime. The big summer festival will also be a big celebration for the 150th.
For the INLNA convention, I am so excited, and I feel honored to be able to go as a representative of the Snorri Foundation and the Snorri Programs, because I think it will be a blast. And not only that, I'm really excited to get to put out some surveys to the community while we are there on the Snorri Programs and what they think, and to give everyone a chance to voice their opinions and provide us feedback and to make the connections. And hear from the fantastic speakers that are lined up. And one of the things I'm really trying to get going is a short promotional video or reel or skit to invite previous Snorri alumni to come join the convention in May. And one of the things I really want to get on the program is a couple of kind of Snorri reunion get-togethers. There's especially going to be one in the evening. But other than that, I'm hoping there will be an opportunity and the time to do like a morning guided walk through Gimli or a morning yoga session or something like that. So for me, getting to be there on May 1st to 4th, I hope the weather will be good and that it'll be starting to see some kind of beginning to summer or a very nice spring. I was there for Icelandic and Vancouver last year, and then we got some beautiful summer weather with the lake there in the background of everything. And in Gimli, I have had the best fish that I have ever eaten outside of Iceland. And now I'm picky about fish. The thing is, back home in Iceland, we buy our fish the day it was caught.
Mm-hmm.
And for those that have been to Iceland, you know that when you go to a restaurant, you get fish that was caught that morning. Unless actually it's a Sunday, then maybe not. But even then, you still might. In the rest of the world, and this is something I grew up with, is that we don't really order fish when we travel, no matter how good they say it is. Because what we get back home is just better. And I think Icelanders very often go for the fish because they're somewhere that should have good fish. And they say, hello, I'd like the fish, please, because you're on the Mediterranean and you have good fish here. And then they get served something that isn't good. And then they come back to Iceland and say, oh, yeah, I tried the fish. It wasn't any good. However, in Gimli, and I think that's just such a credit to the quality of that town. They had packerel, which was just really good. And actually also it is of course always possible to get good fresh fish. It's just kind of you have to know where to look. Mm-hmm. And for me being in Vancouver, I just haven't found a place where they have good fresh fish. However, the people at the Icelandic Club here, at the Icelandic Club of British Columbia, they have a contact in Richmond where they can get really fresh fish. They had coal, I believe, the other day when we had the Sorrablót, and they got that fish down in Richmond. However, it's kind of a bulk order thing. It's more of a fish market style, so they had to buy like 300 pounds. And now for me, sure, I'm hungry, but 300 pounds of fish, like I can't get through that before it's spoiled.
Hey, speak for yourself. I get to come and help.
Yeah, sounds like a plan. Let's do it, Jack.
Okay. Yeah, you can get some incredible fresh lake fish throughout Saskatchewan and Manitoba. My Longavi, when he first was here in Canada, he was in Gimli and doing like ice fishing because I guess they didn't really know, like in the wintertime when the lake freezes over, what do you do? Right? In Iceland, you can always fish the sea year round. So he had to learn, and it wouldn't have been just him, others at the time, learning ice fishing from the local people, whether they were indigenous or also other European settlers that were there, a generation or two before them. And so that was a bit of a learning curve. But it's nice to know that we can get good quality fish in Gimli as well. So, and also nice to know that that is the number one thing you were looking forward to, other than all the other connections you will be making. Icelandic Roots, of course, will have a presence there. And at these conventions is a good place to find the Icelandic Roots booth. And if you haven't delved into the database, that's your opportunity to connect with someone in person and learn about it. Yeah, I think that's been the biggest help for me, like being able to utilize the Icelandic Roots database like with somebody to kind of show you the ropes. There's a lot of clicking involved and different options that sometimes can be overwhelming, even for like native internet users like myself. So that's usually a good thing to do, is to connect with someone, an Icelandic roots volunteer, to learn about the database in person there. And I don't know the extent of who or when or what on behalf of Icelandic roots will be talked about at the convention in Banff 2 years ago. We had like a presentation showcasing the different things Icelandic Roots does from the podcast here. I got a big shout out on the stage for this. And then, of course, to the genealogy work, but also the articles and writing groups and other things. And then also, I was grateful you guys at Snorri got me to talk about what I was doing with the Snorri programs, because that was the spring before I went to do the Snorri internship. So that was really fun. Spoke on stage for Snorri and Icelandic Roots. So little humble old Jack, your humble narrator for this podcast, I was very grateful for those opportunities. It was super fun.
Awesome. Good to hear it. We've really just gone all over the map today, from Paris to Helsinki, all the way over to Banff.
Yeah, the Banff convention was fantastic. Me being Alberta local, born and raised in Red Deer, close to the proximity of Stephen G. Stephenson, where he lived out his life once he settled here. And he was known as the poet of the Rocky Mountains. And so the Rocky Mountains are absolutely beautiful, especially here in Alberta, BC as well. But entering into the Rockies from the east and heading west is really so beautiful. And a couple people remarked on this to me. Some visitors from the States that were here for the convention and some visitors from Iceland that were here for the convention told me that it was just the most beautiful thing that they've seen. And the drive into Banff was very dangerous because they couldn't take their eyes off of the mountains, and they were just shocked at the beauty of the nature. And that made me just recognize, like, yeah, world travel, fantastic. Iceland, beautiful place. I want to spend as much time there, but it's important to find the beauty from wherever you're from. And for me, it's living near the prairies and the Rocky Mountains. But no matter where you are, just remember to look at your local landscape from an outsider's perspective and to just imagine how beautiful it is to someone who's setting their eyes on it for the first time. And that was a cool experience that I had in Banff.
That's something I think we should all be better at doing. It's really a beautiful connection and beautiful parallel that we're drawing up here between Icelanders coming to the Canadian Rockies and saying that it's the most awesome. And then we have Canadians doing the same in Iceland. And on top of that, me personally, I'm a huge fan of the Canadian Rocky Mountains. It's one of the places I've actually spent. Yeah, I've been there a few times. It's where I've just kind of started to spend all my holidays. It wasn't really planned out that way. It just kind of worked out that way.
Yeah.
And I'm not complaining. I'm really happy about it. My other two favorite places in the whole world are the Hotstrandir Nature Reserve in the West Fjords of Iceland and the Icelandic Hálendi, or the Icelandic backcountry, or highlands, as we usually translate them to. But backcountry is a better Canadian translation, as it's what people talk about here. And I'm going to try to make, I probably won't have time to go out to the Icelandic backcountry this year during the summer, things being very busy with Snorri and all that.
Yeah.
But I will have the time to go to the Rockies because the season there is just kind of open longer. It stays snow-free until the end of September or so. Not
and almost
here,
even
maybe, but
more preferable in terms of less tourists around. So September to October can be great. Or honestly, right now, we're having a really dry, like late winter, not even really technically spring yet, and some really beautiful weather days. So going up to the mountains, like right now, middle of March would be good, but April and May can be nice as well. But remember about bear safety. especially for you Icelanders who don't have to worry about dangerous predators when you're hiking in the backcountry. Always remember that you are coexisting there with not only bears, but other potentially dangerous predators, such as
Yeah,
cougars,
and
or
humans.
if you're really out in the wilds, wolves too, although very few cases of wolves actually posing a serious threat to humans, contrary to a lot of mythology. Maybe it was more true back in the day, but definitely nothing anytime recently.
Well, that's good to know. I guess in a way we did domesticate wolves into dogs. Isn't
Yeah,
that
and
how the
eradicate
story
them,
goes?
unfortunately. So wolves are probably the least common predator you will encounter, at least in any areas that are not like in the very far north. So grizzly bears, they're still quite abundant in the Rockies, great from a conservation standpoint. But it's serious, really genuinely serious, to know how to properly coexist around them
Mm.
when you're in their territory, especially when we're talking about the late fall. That's when they're really stocking up on food for their long winter sleep, so they can be more aggressive around that time. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There for the last 2 years I've heard stories of someone either being killed by actually being killed by bears in the late fall. So that's definitely something I've had to come to terms with. And for a
Yeah.
personal story, that's actually how I came to terms with death.
Okay.
Within the Canadian wilderness, when I was doing a 2-day hike up to the summit of Golden Ears, and that's a mountain west of Vancouver, up north from Maple Ridge, for those that know the area. And it's actually really an awesome hike, an awesome campground, and just an incredible summit where you see the coastal mountains to the east, and then you can also see the city lights of Vancouver and the Fraser Valley to the west.
Hmm.
But so what happened this time is that for about my first 5 nights, when I have been on backpacking trips in the Canadian backcountry, I just wasn't able to sleep
Hmm.
because I was so afraid of like the mice and squirrels rustling in the bushes, and I'd be like, oh my god, what if it's a bear? And then kind of, I did get like some rest and ended up falling asleep for some time, but man, it was difficult. And then this one time in my tent at this awesome campground, which is on a kind of ridge almost, overlooking everything, I just kind of realized, well, if it's my time, it's my time.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, sure, it is something to contend with, and even just the vastness of nature, even when there's no predatory animals to be wary of. I mean, when you're out in the backcountry in Iceland or any other areas, there's just you lose all of the protections that cities provide or communities provide. And so it is something to be mindful of, just that nature doesn't care about you. Nature is not there solely to protect you, some singular human being who's hiking. And so you have to be wise and you have to be careful for yourself. And you also have to, like you say, have a bit of reverence for just what is outside of your control. But I'm glad you've been able to explore a lot of the wilderness here in Western Canada, Western North America.
Yeah, I have just felt privileged, and it's one of my favorite things to do. And I try to get out there as much as I can, but also being in Vancouver without a car, it becomes kind of tricky
Mm.
because then it's like a question of transportation to the trailheads and to these beautiful places, and just a question of getting out of the city. Like for this one hike I did, I had to drive for 3 hours until I got out of an urban area. And if there are Icelanders listening, like most of us have driven to Akureyri, right?
Mhm.
And that's about 4 hours, a bit less, or with stops more. Now imagine if the whole way up to Blundos, which is like maybe 3/4 of the way to Akureyri, you just had like city rows next to you, all the way up through Moso, up through Borgarnes, up through all of that.
Mm-hmm.
You just had city blocks on the left and on the right. Yeah, so that was kind of a culture shock, I'd say.
Yeah, the
And
urban density.
yeah, and just it's sprawled too, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just sprawled all the way down that valley.
I guess that's a good point. Yeah, it is sprawl. I just think it's density in that. Yeah, it's just houses and buildings. But Vancouver does a great job of incorporating nature into the city. I don't even know if that's so much chalked up to urban planning or it's just, the climate out there. And it's very, very much so, especially when you get out to Vancouver Island and a little bit north, not too far north, but in those areas, they are temperate rainforests. And so the trees grow larger than anywhere else in North America, except for the redwoods in California. But in my mind, that's all sort of a continuous kind of natural area, all up and down the West Coast. So it's quite special.
Yeah, it is. And Vancouver Island is really very special. It's slower. It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Just the pace of life. Yeah. I'm trying to plan a trip out there.
Yeah. How's that going? Bicycling with no hands.
Well, with no hands the whole way. I don't know about that. Maybe the bits that aren't on the highway, I'll rest my hands and relax. But the trip plan was supposed to start today originally, actually.
Oh.
But then just work kind of kept me here. And then, in case I do back out, I don't want to share everything about it or say oh, I'm gonna do it, and then I just end up backing out. Yeah, there's just ideas. But the idea is to get on my bike, strap some bicycle bags to it. Well, I'm not just strapping bicycle bags; they're specifically made for bike packing. Mm-hmm. And then I just bring a tent, a sleeping bag, and then I just set off from here and stop at grocery stores and eat at cafes or restaurants on the way, and then just bike maybe 40 kilometers a day, 40 to 50, which is apparently kind of okay for a beginner, as this would be my first trip. And then hopefully I can make some make a YouTube video about it, and then I'd make one in Icelandic and one in English, just kind of show this route.
Well, I wish you luck. Even if you do 1/10 of that sort of a plan, that's ambitious and it sounds fun, and it's a great way to get out there and experience the world on a bicycle. Yeah. Sometimes using your hands, other times without.
Yeah, and then, who knows, maybe I set off and on the first day I make it to North Vancouver and then my bicycle breaks or I hurt my knee. So you never know with life, but these are the opportunities that we get. Mm-hmm. And it's important to take advantage of them because we'll never be at this place in our lives again. One of the philosophies I have is that our days are counted. This is it. We're here now, and after many thousands of days, fortunately, we won't be here anymore. But so it reminds me to live every day to its fullest and really just do my best and grab the opportunities when they arrive. Carpe diem. Am I right?
Þetta reddest. Well, that's very profound. Hear, hear. Maybe this is a good way to wrap it up. People can come say hi to you in Gimli for the INL convention. You won't be there next summer, though, will you? You went last summer?
I went last summer. Now it's Julie's turn, so she'll be there
Nice.
for Icelandic and and
Did you
the
make it
Deuce
to
of
North
August.
Dakota too?
I did. Yes.
Okay, so you do both. Yep.
Yeah. Important
Awesome.
events.
That's the way to do it. The Deuce of August and Icelanding and Dagrun. So, yeah, go look for Atli there. Say hello. Tell him that you like the podcast. And yeah, I'll say hi to him if you're there next summer in Iceland as well.
Ask me any questions you might have about the Snorri programs.
Will you be around late summer in Iceland? Late August, early September?
Yeah, I'll be in Iceland until September 8th when I go on my annual vacation to the Canadian Rocky Mountains.
Cool. Well, I will be there with other Icelandic Roots volunteers and members doing the wonderful Icelandic Roots trip, which will be focusing on the west side of the island this year. So maybe we will have to arrange something so we can connect with you in Reykjavik before we take off.
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. Do you have any Icelandic poetry to recite to us?
Yeah. If I can remember it. Til eru fræ sem falla í jörð en verða aldrei blóm. Yeah, can't remember the rest.
Okay, takk fyrir. Bless.
Bless. If you would like to dive as deep as possible into your Icelandic roots, then I would like to invite all of you listening to join this summer's Snorri Programs. In total, there are 5 Snorri Programs, but the trips that we're doing this summer and you might be interested in are the original Snorri Program and the Snorri Plus Program. The original Snorri Program is a 5-week cultural heritage trip to Iceland for 20 to 30-year-old North Americans of Icelandic descent. It started in 1999 and it consists of a 2-week educational and cultural exploration program in Reykjavik, followed by a 2-week homestay with your relatives, and then finally a 1-week adventure tour around Iceland. The Snorri Plus program is open to everyone, and it is targeted to North Americans over the age of 30 or below the age of 20 that have Icelandic heritage. It's a condensed version of the original Snorri program, consisting of 1 week in Reykjavik, doing a heritage and cultural program, where one of the events is a cousins cafe, where you will get to meet your Icelandic cousins. Typically, they'll be 4th or 5th, maybe even 3rd, or if you're a very recent immigrant, then could be 2nd or 1st. The Snorri Plus program finishes with a 1-week adventure tour around Iceland, exploring eastern Iceland and the area around Icelander, and then going up north to where most of the Icelanders that left Iceland to move to North America left from.